Welcome everyone. We'll just give you a few seconds here to let you all in from the waiting room. Make sure we have everybody coming in. Won't be long and we'll kick off with today's presentation. So we'll start off with our introduction. Welcome to today's ParaBoss webinar. It is absolutely wonderful to have you all on board this afternoon. For those of you who are new to ParaBoss, ParaBoss is Australia's resource for the control of worms, lice, flies and ticks. We cover many different species. We do cattle, sheep and goats, but today we are all here to talk about managing worms in goats. So WormBoss initiative under our ParaBoss main banner. It's a joint initiative, ParaBoss, with Australian Wool Innovation, Meat and Livestock Australia, the University of New England and Animal Health Australia. You can connect with ParaBoss in a number of different ways. You can scan this QR code while we have this up on screen with you. It will take you straight to our page, or you can join and follow us as well on Facebook at paraboss.com, and you can email us at admin@paraboss.com.au, and please subscribe to our e-newsletter. If you go to all the W's, paraboss.com/subscriptions, you'll be able to join up to our newsletter from there. There's lots of new things happening on the ParaBoss platform at the moment, so I encourage you all to join up and follow us in whatever way suits you. So before we begin, my name is Fiona MacArthur and I am part of the new ParaBoss extension team. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to everybody else that we have online today, which is great to have so many people joining us for today's webinar. The webinar is being recorded, just a little bit of a reminder about that. And we will have that download available for you. We're going to have quite an extensive Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And I thank everybody in advance for sending your questions in. And we had a tremendous response when it came to question time. So we're going to have a great discussion following our presentation today. But it's not too late to ask questions. You can use your question tab, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen, and you can add your questions into there and we will address them for you at the end of today's presentation. I'll introduce Megan officially in a minute, but we also have Megan Rogers online as well today, and you can chat to Megan through the chat tab if you have any questions or queries that you just need help with. So it's a bit of an open communication for the chat versus the Q&A that's just for our Q&A session. So we're now going to launch a couple of poll questions very quickly for you. Poll questions are great as a webinar coordinator because they give me feedback that you are able to engage with us, and they also will give us really good information for our presenters and our panelists today. It's really great to know who's online and what the makeup is so we can help tailor the presentation to meet your needs specifically. So our first two questions that we have up, which I can see everybody starting to engage with, which is just fantastic. We have, what is your industry role? And you can choose goat producer, veterinarian advisor as a goat producer, or a veterinarian not advising to goat producers, livestock advisor or other. And also, where are you located? And we have Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, the Northern Territory, Tasmania, and interstate. So a fair bit of activity on that poll, so we might just leave that open for a little bit longer. We only have a couple of polls for you today, but
just on that, everybody, I'm not sure why ACT hasn't come through with New South Wales. If you're in the ACT, just click on New South Wales if that's okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Megan. That seems to have stabilised off there. So we've got 59% of goat producers, 11% vets advising to goat producers, and 2% of vets who don't advise to goat producers, livestock advisors and other, and 38% from Queensland, 36% from New South Wales and the ACT, 14% from Victoria, 2% from South Australia, 1% from WA. just click down for me. The one from the Northern Territory, 6% from Tassie and 3% from overseas. So welcome everybody from across Australia and internationally. So we'll just get that next poll up for you now. So our next poll is all about your herd size for our goat producers that are online. So this is for goat producers and a question for producers only. Do you have less than 20, between 20 and 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 500, or over 500? We've opened that poll up now and the answers are coming through really quickly. So I do thank everybody for participating. It's very good feedback for us. It's certainly very helpful to our presenter. It's settling down now, so we might share the results with you on screen. And we have 30% less than 20, 18% 20 to 50, 8% 50 to 100, 17% 100 to 500, and 27% over 500 goats in their herd. Thank you everyone for participating in that poll. And we'll just we have one more poll. Megan's popping them through for us now. Worm egg counts. Do you conduct worm egg counts for your herd? Yes, once a year. Yes, 2 to 4 times a year. Yes, 4 to 8 times a year. Yes, 10 to 12 times a year. Yes, for larval cultures. And no, I don't use worm egg counts in my herd. So we've got quite a few options there. We did them quite specifically to get a feel for what everybody is doing with their management strategies out there, so we can work out how to best help you all.
You should be able to, if you do conduct worm egg counts, you should be able to click on whichever option you'd like, plus larval cultures if you're doing larval cultures. Just gives us a good idea on how we can shape today's presentation.
So you can answer more than once there. That's great. Okay, and that's settled down there now, so we might share those results with you on screen. So yes, once a year, 13%, 2 to 4 times a year, 16%, 4 to 8 times a year, 18%, 10 to 12 times a year, 10%. And of those, 14% use larval cultures. That's the way I read that. And no, I don't use worm egg counts in my herd is 39%. So thank you very much for participating in that poll. And Megan, do we have any other polls? No, so that's it for the polls today, everybody. So thank you so much. It's now time to begin today's presentation. So I would like to warmly just introduce our presenter, and we also have a panelist as well for our Q&A session. So I'm going to introduce both at the same time. So we have Dr. Matt Playford, who you'll see on screen at the moment. Matt is our presenter for today, talking all about worm controlling goats. Matt grew up in Cowra on the central tablelands of New South Wales, and has done extensive study and travel throughout the world, and has then become a veterinary consultant. He's been this for over 17 years and is also the director of Doorbutts, which is a company that runs a parasitology laboratory and conducts research on behalf of the livestock industries. So a very warm welcome to Matt there. And we will also be joined by Berin Squire, who works as a vet officer in northwestern Victoria, which also assists many Victorian goat producers with their disease welfare and legislative issues. Berin's also been heavily involved in industry directly, as she owns her very own small boar goat herd. So we will welcome Berin later on in our Q&A panel. So I encourage you once again, if you have any questions for either Matt as we go through or for Berin later on, if you pop them in that Q&A panel, I'll make sure they get all the responses that come through. So we'll just share Matt's screen now and get that up on screen for you. Matt, you should be able to do that from your end, and I invite you to unmute yourself. Just while Matt's doing that, I'd just like to add a little comment before we get started, and that is for all the goat producers out there. Here at ParaBoss, we do understand that the goat industry is lagging a little bit behind in some of the recommendations that are out there for drench use. And at the moment, unfortunately, the only you can only go to your vet to get specific recommendations about drenches and dose rates. So it's not really something that we're going to deal with particularly heavily here in this presentation, but Matt will talk more to that. We aim here to provide you with key information about a really holistic approach to worm management on your goat farm. So I encourage you to stay open-minded. Matt's going to have quite a few different suggestions that may be outside of the box for you today about how we can improve worm management on your goat farms. So on that, I warmly welcome Matt. Thanks, Matt, and I hope everyone enjoys the presentation.
Thanks, Fiona. And I have to say a big thank you to both Fiona and Megan for organising this webinar, and also to our special guest, expert commentator, Berin Squire. And welcome, Berin. Thank you for agreeing to be part of the panel today. Now, the idea with today's presentation is this is a no-holds-barred examination of everything to do with worm control in goats. And the key word there is sustainable. And I want to make sure that we frame this, this presentation correctly, because we're not interested in short-term solutions, in things that are going to work today and are going to jeopardise our goat farms in the future. So the key word sustainable, and hopefully the reason for that will become apparent as we go through the presentation. Now, this is me. I look like I'm very happy with things, but the truth of the matter is I'm often very cranky, and I'll just explain why. When we're doing worm egg counts in the laboratory for our goat producers, we have to think of all of the reasons why people are doing parasitology in their goats. And the main reason for us as veterinary parasitologists is animal welfare, closely followed by animal health and productivity. But there are a lot of other reasons why we need to have good, sustainable worm control. And they include our social license. We want the society, the community that we're a part of, to actually approve of the things that we're doing. We also have ethical obligations, legal obligations, and we have industry pressure to make sure that the things that we do with our goats are going to be acceptable for trade and for our trading partners. So just to get things in perspective right from the start, we need to look at a few things to do with drenches in goats. The first thing to remember that's different from how things used to be, even only a few short years ago, is that drenches may not kill the worms.
Matt, just for a second, I'm getting a bit of comment coming through now, just with regards to the presentation format. Can you just spend a couple of minutes and explain the presentation format? People are saying that they can't see all of the words, that they, a little while ago, they could only see the goat. So can you just verify how that's going to take place throughout the presentation? That'll save people being concerned about that.
Right, okay, thanks Megan. So when we're looking at the goats, we can look at the goats, and then it moves over to the words, and we'll be able to look at the words. I hope that's clear. It's not a PowerPoint presentation, and the reason is because we're using this to see the big picture and focus on the smaller details as they come up. So I hope that's clear. Bear with us; it'll all come through in the wash. Is that okay, Megan?
Matt, maybe you could pull down Fiona here. Maybe you could, are you able to reduce the screen to show them your beautiful big game card just really briefly, and then come back out to your writing so they can see we're about to go through this really, this is Matt's picture, everybody.
This is the big picture, yeah.
Yeah. We're zoning in. He's up the top of the screen there at the moment, and he's zoning in on that. And that should now make more sense to you as he goes around his worm game. Thanks, Matt.
Okay, now the first thing is there's a few things about drenches in goats that, as a veterinary parasitologist and the team that we work with, are very clear to us, but may not be apparent to everyone. The first thing is the drenches that we're using are generally sheep drenches, and due to goats' metabolism, particularly the incredible ability of the goat's liver to detoxify and metabolize these compounds, they may not work. They certainly won't work at the normal dose rates that they use in for goats, for sheep or for cattle. The other thing is, over the last 10 years, there has been a huge amount of resistance developed to all the worms in both sheep and cattle, and they are shared with the goats. So tip number one, or important point number one, the drenches may not kill the worms. And this is a problem that's getting worse year by year. The second thing is, every time we drench our goats, we select for resistant worms, so the problem gets worse. And the goats share those worms with sheep and spread the joy. Third thing is, drenches may cause residues in meat and milk. Now, these are critically important components of the industry of which we're part of. And even if our goats aren't intended to be used for meat or milk, they're legally classified as production animals. And they will potentially enter the food chain, and everything we do with our goats has to be compliant with the laws that protect people from those residues. The fourth point is, drenches could make the goat sick. So a good example is a product that might contain abamectin, levamisole, placental. All of these compounds will cause toxicity in our goats, particularly for young goats. And the fifth thing is, drenches are illegal to use. Now, if you look at the label of the drench that's in your cupboard, it's a legal document. It's been prepared by the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority. Now, if it doesn't state that that product can be used at the dose you're using, then state laws and federal laws prohibit its use. Now, the thing that we have available to us to allow drenches for other animals to be used in goats is what's called off-label prescribing by vets. And vets are very aware of their responsibilities when they're using these off-label prescribing laws. But because of the legal and ethical problems that they face, your vet will often have other measures that they wish to use rather than just reaching for the drenches. Okay, I hope we've established the ground rules there, and we'll move on to the big picture, because the big picture actually is very good for goats. Goats are wonderful animals, and one of the best things about working with goat producers is seeing the relationships that people have with their goats, because they have so much character and personality that people are able to interact with them in a very healthy way. So we're going to be looking at the life cycle of the worms and how we can use different interventions to control the worms rather than simply relying on drenches. Now, coming back to that keyword sustainable, if we need to rely on drenches all the time, then we're not looking at a sustainable system. And we need to adapt the system somehow to improve things so that we're not simply relying on drenches. Now, this goat's very smart. He knows that there's no worms in the trees here, the good old Argyle apple that he's chewing on. And goats are very happy as browsers because they prefer to actually put their heads up and eat things off trees or shrubs than put their heads down. And they know this instinctively because they're aware that they don't have very strong immune systems against the worms that are typically on a pasture. Compared to cattle and sheep, in fact, they're very susceptible to worms. And when we put the goats onto pasture and force them to put their heads down to eat, then we're putting them into a place where they're actually having the odds tipped against them because we're forcing them to eat lots of worm larvae. Now, we have to go back into history. Before goats were even domesticated, they used to roam wild across the earth, and they wouldn't revisit the pastures very often. They'd actually maybe only come and eat a pasture after they'd been spelling it themselves for several months. And so the contamination with worms was reduced. But when we farm goats, we actually create the natural enemy of the goat. And I think you've probably cottoned on to what the natural enemy of the goat is. It's actually the fence. As soon as we put goats behind fences, then we're tipping the odds in the worm's favour, and it's an unfair fight. The worms then have the power to overwhelm our goats' immune systems. So what can we do to overcome this? Well, the first thing is understanding the problem. So thinking back to the big picture, what actually goes on in our pastures? In the grass there's a dewdrop, and it's full of little worm larvae. Now, these worm larvae contaminate every pasture to some extent. They're not always up there in the high parts of the grass. A lot of the time, or most of the time, they're down in the bottom 5 centimetres of the grass and the top centimetre of soil. And if the grass is contaminated with goat droppings, there'll almost certainly be huge amounts of contamination with these larvae. And so this is the first point we need to remember in the life cycle of the worms. The goats pick up the larval worms, which are only 0.7 millimetres long, from the grass and the dirt. So if we observe our goats going about their business, you can see they're usually keen to have a bit of a feed, and they'll put their head down and they'll eat whatever's there. And a lot of the time they'll be picking up these worm larvae. Okay, what happens to those worm larvae? Well, they go down the goat's esophagus and they molt, and then they go into their preferred part of the gastrointestinal tract. Now, oftentimes that's into the stomach. So this little bloke, as soon as he's weaned, he'll get onto the grass and start picking up those worm larvae. Same with this little fella. He's an adult goat, not a real big adult goat, but still an adult goat. And even though he's quite hardy in most respects, hasn't developed much immunity to the worms. Now, as immunity develops, you'll find that less worms will actually develop from a juvenile larva up into an adult. The adults will lay less eggs, and the adults will be expelled more quickly. But of course, unless the goats are in prime condition and only have small amounts of worms, this won't take place. So the second part of the life cycle is the worms grow to adult worms inside the goat's stomach and intestines. And so the male and female worms mate, and the females will lay eggs, and those eggs will hatch. This is where it all takes place, down inside the fourth stomach, in particular in the abomasum, and that's where we find these nasty worms, Haemonchus, Osteotargia, and most goats will be carrying Telodosargia, which is the sheep type of brown stomach worm, but cattle brown stomach worm will also survive in some goats as well. That's the Osteotargia. And Haemonchus, of course, is the barber's pole worm. And then in the large intestine, we have these other large intestinal worms that look very impressive, but they really don't have much of an impact on goats. You're much more likely to have an impact from these worms, which are the barber's pole worms inside the fourth stomach. Now, the reason why they have an impact is that each one of these worms is capable of sucking 0.05 ml of blood per day. So it only takes 20 worms to suck a ml of blood. And once you have 2,000 worms, of course, they'll be sucking 100 ml of blood out of the mucosa, the lining of the fourth stomach. So that's going to have a big impact on the goats. Now, I'm afraid this is a photo of a sheep, but it does demonstrate the technique that's used to see if the if the goats are impacted by Barber's pole worms, and that is to very gently expose the lower eyelid. In fact, on this sheep picture, we can see both the third eyelid and the lower eyelid, and looking at the colour of that lower eyelid. And this, of course, has been codified in the farmer chart system. And I'd strongly encourage anyone who's keeping goats to avail themselves of a training course so that you can actually use the farmer chart cards, the colour charts, and use that to monitor your goats. Now, this picture actually shows a nice pink colour, and the next sheep we can see has quite a pale colour. It might even be a little bit jaundiced. So there's a big difference in the colour that you see in the eyelids of both sheep and goats when they're affected by Barber's pole worms. The other thing that you'll see is bottled jaw, which is where underneath the lower jaw there's a soft fluid swelling that indicates that the animal has low blood proteins because the Barber's pole worms have been sucking the blood and there's been protein loss from the animal's body. So that's a soft fluid swelling underneath the jaw. The third thing that's very easy to monitor is body condition score. So you put your hands onto the animal's back, just behind the rib cage, and you feel for the bones there and see how much covering is on them. And that's an easy way, apart from weighing the goats, tell how their body condition is going. Okay, the third part of the worm life cycle is the adult worms lay eggs that are passed out in the dung pellets. When we look at the eggs under the microscope, we can see those typical strongyle eggs, and both Barber's pole worm, brown stomach worm look pretty much the same, and also black scour worms. Okay, so we can use this as a way of monitoring the goats. And the great thing about this is when we're looking at things like the colour change in the third eyelid or the body condition score or bottle jaw, they're telling us that the goat's got worms after they're already sick. But if you're using these worm egg counts by collecting a handful of fresh dung, when we say fresh dung, less than 10 minutes after it's been passed by the goats, every month we can test for worm eggs and monitor how well the goats are going before they get sick. So this is something that's done by many producers already, and if you're not doing it, it's a great way of improving your monitoring of the goat's health. You can pick them up off the ground as long as they're less than 10 minutes old. You can actually put on a glove and collect them directly from the rectum of the goats, but most people prefer just to pick up samples as the goats are actually voluntarily voiding them. And you can get a nice sample from the goats after they've been in the pen for a short while to collect and test. Just as long as you make sure you have the name of the goat and the date, you can actually tell which samples belong to which animal, and also the time they were collected. So once you've got your samples, there's several things you can do. You can send them to your preferred laboratory, and here's Georgia in the Dorbert's laboratory preparing samples there. And the good thing about the laboratory testing is that there is a ParaBoss WEC QA program that audits the laboratories to make sure that they're doing things the right way. And the people who work in those laboratories, of course, are professionals who do this all day, every day. And you can see Phil and Adriana in our laboratory there, and they're seasoned industry professionals. And so they'll be the first ones to know if there's anything going wrong with your goats. Here's Andrew as well, doing a liver fluke test, which is another test you can do by sending samples to the laboratory. Now, that's not the only way, of course. You can also send samples to your local vet, or you can use one of these FECPAC machines. And I have to do full disclosure, Dorbert's is the agent for the FECPAC machines. And they actually use this little microscope camera to count the number of eggs in the sample. So there's a skilled technician at the other end of the camera doing the counts for you, so you don't have to actually become a parasitologist yourself. And then they count the eggs and send you a report. Now, there are a lot of trials that have looked at how accurate this is, and this particular one, funded by Meat and Livestock Australia, using your levies, compared the FECPAC machine with another industry standard, the mini FlowTac microscope-based methods, for testing worm egg counts in goats, and found that they were pretty much the same. So if that's a more convenient way for you to do it, then it might be worth considering. It's not the only way, however. There's another system called Parasite System, and they use a similar approach where they use a microscope connected to a camera to count the number of eggs. So that might be worth considering as well. Now, in general terms, if the worm egg count is low, the goats are okay. And if the worm egg count is high, it means there's a lot of worms and the goats may get sick. How do we interpret worm egg counts? Well, I think this is a very, very detailed subject that does require a whole webinar on its own. But in the meantime, let's just go through a few basic features. So with this results summary, we can see that there's 4 goats, Mini, Willow, Tilly and Mambo. And they all had their samples collected on the 11th of June. They're minis. And we look at their worm egg counts, and Tilly's got a 0. There were no eggs detected. Willow's only got 35 eggs per gram, and Minnie and Mambo have each got 70 eggs per gram. So they're all very low. And it's not until the worm egg count in goats gets above 200 that we start to become slightly concerned. 500 we become moderately concerned. And about 1,000 is where we think, an intervention's probably necessary. But there are a lot of other subjects that we need to incorporate into that decision. Now, when we look at this particular group, we can see here's 5 mobs of goats that have been treated with different drenches. And we can see that their worm egg count has remained very, very high. So the counts there, we're getting 4,380, 4,180, all in goats that have been already treated with a drench 14 days before. Now, this shows the power of your worm egg count to determine if the drench that you're using actually works. Now, the drenches are used to treat goats when the worm egg numbers are high. And I've just included a couple of examples of drenches that I know that many of our producers are using in goats. And I have to just emphasise again, these are all off-label, which means it's illegal to use them unless under veterinary prescription. And emphasising the ethical and legal obligations we have as responsible advisors and goat producers to our industry and to the people that may be our customers. Now, a lot of people have asked about organic treatments or things that may not impact the goats so much. And we know that often copper oxide wire particles are used for, and the label actually states that they can be used in adult goats. Must not be used in goats under 2 months of age. But the other thing to remember is the label states that they're for the treatment and prevention of copper deficiency, not for treating worms. So again, if you're using copper oxide wire particles, that's an off-label use. You really should have a vet script for doing that. Also, caution, because copper can be toxic, and I know that there are cases on record just recently where people have overtreated goats with copper oxide, and they've had toxicity due to that. Another one is Barbavax, and Barbavax is a vaccine that was developed for sheep, and is used quite widely in the places where there are a lot of Barber's pole worms. So Barbavax has been widely used in sheep, and there are very good track records. Most of the trials seem to show that the reduction in worm egg count is about 60 to 70% in sheep flocks that have been given Barbavax. Now, it's important to remember that Barbavax is, again, not registered for goats, and even though some people are using it in goats, it is an off-label use. The reason why it's not registered for goats, just incidentally, as a matter of interest, is because when they did the trials to register it in goats, there was one trial that went very well, one trial that was quite equivocal, and one trial didn't go so well. And so on the strength of that, the regulatory body said, well, we're not going to register it for goats. Doesn't mean it doesn't work in goats, but you have to appreciate that it is an off-label treatment because it's a sheep vaccine. And therefore, just remember, you'll have to talk to your vet and get them to prescribe it if you want to protect your goats against Barber's pole worms using Barbavax. The other thing that's probably worth emphasising now is that Barbavax works best if you think of it as a way of not so much protecting the goats themselves, but as a way of slowing down or reducing the amount of pasture contamination with the larval worms that the goats are going to pick up in the future. Okay, so how does this impact our fine-looking Boer goats here? There is another way of reducing worm contamination of the pastures, and that's biowormer. This is a fungus that's included in the feed, so you give the biowormer in pellets to the goats every day, and then the fungus goes into the dung, and it actually traps and then kills the larvae that are in the dung and stops them from escaping and contaminating the pastures. So that's another very useful way of approaching the larval contamination problem. And that's particularly for smaller producers. Producers with under 20 goats might find this a very cost-effective way of reducing pasture contamination. Okay, now just getting back to worm egg counts. If we count the worm eggs after treatment, we can tell how well the treatment works. So all of these treatments may or may not give us an effect for the reasons I've described previously. But 2 weeks is the ideal time. So if we give, this one is actually treating sheep, but the principle is the same. 2 weeks after treatment, we take some samples and send them to the lab or do the worm egg count, and we can work out what the % reduction is. And that % reduction will be different for each species of worm, because some worms will be affected by the drench, some won't be. And if we do a worm ID or a larval culture, identify which worms are surviving, then that will tell us the efficacy of each treatment against that type of worm. And this is a results sheet that shows the drench efficacy for 3 different types of worms for 6 different treatments. And you can see that in these goats, the small brown stomach worms weren't killed by the BZ, which is the white drench. Only 12% of them were actually killed. Weren't killed by the levamisole, the LVS, only 47% were killed. Placental, we know, is a Barber's pole specific active ingredient, so it's not intended to kill small brown stomach worm. Abamectin did, moxidectin was 71%, monipantal was 100%. Now, the big issue that we have with goat farms is that every farm has its own resistance profile. And so your goats have worms that have different resistance to every other goat on the planet, every other goat farm on the planet. And so unless you do a drench efficacy test yourself, you won't really know what's going to happen. So it's impossible for anyone, including myself, to say what's the ideal drench for goats, because one doesn't exist. There's no single answer, and you really should be doing a drench efficacy test to work out which one will work best for your goats. Okay, so we need to consider fibre goats, meat goats, rangeland goats, dairy goats, and backyard goats like the pygmies that may even be used for dairy as well, to work out what's the best strategy for each one. And that's simply the reason, in a nutshell, why we can't have a blanket approach to worm control for any particular goat property. Now, all of the subjects that I've talked about so far have been included in the WormBoss program. So if you haven't had a look yet, please go to the WormBoss website, and you'll see a lot of information there about worm control for goats. Now, some of the information is framed as sheep information, but rest assured, anything that refers to pastures, paddock management, and ways of decreasing larval contamination on pasture will also apply to your goats. The other thing is, in WormBoss, we have the drench decision guides and the pasture management guides, which are very useful reading. The other thing that's worth getting is the Going Into Goats manual, which is Meat and Livestock Australia and MLA publication. And you can download these from the internet. And this one, Module 9, looks at all aspects of parasite control. And the third resource that's very useful is this Farmer's Guide to Goat Diseases, again published by Meat and Livestock Australia in conjunction with CSIRO and PERSA in South Australia. So all three of those resources are available on the internet for you to download, and I'd encourage you to have a look at them so that you can be fully abreast of the conditions and the issues you're going to be facing with your goats. So just coming back to drenches, I don't want to hammer the point, but there are a multitude of reasons why we can't simply turn to drenches and expect them to be doing a magic trick to relieve our goats of worms. Every time we use a drench, it goes very quickly through the goat system, and those goats go back onto paddocks usually that are full of worms. So if we focus on the paddocks as well as the goats, then we'll have a lot better chance of having good worm control than if we're just focusing on the goats themselves. So let's consider the big picture, and I wish you all very happy and healthy goats, and leave you with these take-home messages. The first one is monitor your goats. Look at your goats, particularly their eyes, look at their body condition score, weigh them to get their average daily gain. If their weights are going down, if their body condition score is going backwards, if their eyes are very pale, you know they already have a problem. Do worm egg counts and worm ID, because that enables you to look over the horizon and anticipate the problems before they actually affect your goat's health and welfare. Get a whole farm plan, map out your paddocks so that you know which paddocks are more likely to be contaminated, which ones have been spelled, which ones are best for your most susceptible animals. Use all the tools available. Use pasture management, animal management, your diagnostic tools, and then work with your vet to enable you to make the best use of the drenches that are present for when you need them as well. Now, I know there's a lot of questions and chat have come up, so I'm going to hand back to Megan so that we can take questions now.
Thanks, Matt. Fiona here.
Oh, hi, Fiona.
And yes, there are a lot of questions, and I will apologise in advance if I miss one, because they're coming through on the chat and the Q&A, and I've got past questions, but bear with us, everybody. I will get to them all. I invite Berin to join us as well and unmute herself. And we will kick off straight away with what drenches, Matt, are registered for goats, and are they readily available?
Yep. There's a simple answer to that. There's a couple that are registered for goats in the white drenches, BZs. There's a couple. There's a Morantel paste called Oraljet, and that's about it at the moment. Now, would I recommend that you use them? Not really, because we know that there's a lot of resistance to those drenches that are available for goats. And I'd just invite Berin to comment on that.
I'm actually of the different view from Matt. I'm of the view that you try and use the drenches which are registered for goats, but get the dose rate in writing from your private vet, and do fecal egg counts 14 days after the treatment. If they then don't work, then you go for the combinations. Because basically when you introduce any new goats, you do actually want to treat them, if it is allowed, with a combination drench, because you don't know, the former owner might be quite fine on your property using ivermectin or something else like that, but where you've purchased the goat from, they may have had resistance. So when you are introducing any new goats to your property, you really need to make sure that you use a drench with written permission from your private vet that you've got a relationship with, that has the potential to get rid of any worms that are resistant to any of the products that you may use on your farm, before that animal then goes out and spreads all those resistant worms all on your farm. And a quarantine, it's not 14 days, it's up to 30 days. And that enables you to do weed seeds, testing for other diseases, treatment for lice, and treatment for worms.
Thanks, Berin. I think we were still on that original question. My apologies, my internet dropped out then. Moving on.
Basically,
sorry.
There are a couple that are registered. You've got your as Matt mentioned. I mean, don't talk on. When you look at a chemical, you've got to look at what the chemical is made of. There are a lot of different drenches out there with all different names, but they may be of the same chemical family. So you've really got to work out what of the chemical families work. And with ones which are registered in goats, you've got the albendazole, the fenbendazole, the oxfenbendazoles. Ivermectin used to be, but is no longer. And that's basically it.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the next question because we have a huge number of questions. I've grouped them all together. We have a lot of questions to do with on and off label drenches, and there's no surprise there. Firstly, can we just rehash what is the difference between an on and off label product?
Yeah, so in simple terms, if the label actually says can be used on goats and you're happy, or your vet or advisor is happy with the dose rate, then that's called an on-label usage. Every other usage is off-label, which means it's illegal. Now, your vets are very aware of this, and the Veterinary Surgeons Board, which registers vets in each state, is also aware of this. The legal qualification that we have is that if a vet has looked at your goats, then they can prescribe an off-label usage. as long as they're happy with you know, the actual prescription. And so that's the legal definition. It essentially means that if you're using products on goats that don't have that dose rate and that recommendation on the label, then you're doing an illegal use.
Thanks, Matt. When will more drenches become registered for goats in Australia?
You want that one, Baron?
No one has a crystal ball. It basically comes down to economic viability for the chemical companies to develop and register it in goats. It is a huge cost to register to do the research to register chemicals in goats. Unfortunately, but due to the lack of use, we have actually lost drenches that were registered in goats at a goat dose rate.
Baron, I have a follow-up question and you can answer same response if it is. What is going on in research at the moment for drenches in goats that are currently off-label to make them registered for use?
Recently, there was research done. Unfortunately, I've not seen the results as yet of that research. The issue is potentially the current legislation that we've got. Currently, in Victoria, you can use sheep products over the counter at the sheep dose in goats, but that's an incorrect dose. So you need to get an off-label advice of the correct dose and the withholding periods from your private vet. In South Australia, you can use the cattle products, but again, that's at the incorrect dose. So you need to get that from your private vet. In all other states, you need to get the dose rate from your private vet that you've got a relationship with for the situation that is occurring on your property. Now, your vet, some producers do a whole farm plan, an annual farm plan with their private vet, that they just need to send them the fecal egg counts, and the vet says, yes, I approve you to use that in writing, that particular drug. But the big thing is a lot of people just go and get what's available at the rural merchandiser and don't understand the way the goats metabolize drenches and the fact that they could be causing a residue in the meat or the milk that affects the goat industry as a whole. They might say, oh, it's just a pet. They don't understand that unfortunately that pet might be taken and ended up in an abattoir, and it could jeopardize the whole goat industry in Australia.
Thanks, Baron. Next question, and I'm sorry I'm pushing through this all quite quickly, people, but I want everybody to get answers to their question. Why can't research being undertaken in other countries contribute to getting drenches approved here in Australia?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. We've had a lot of information from Europe, for example, where Trinomectin or Epinex Poron was registered for goats, and they have a particular need for worm control in their big dairy goat herds. Now, that hasn't gone particularly well. In fact, you know, a few years down the track, we find that most of the farms that have used that product have got very extensive resistance. And that was reported at last year's World Veterinary Parasitology meeting. Most of the farms that have used that registered product have got resistance. So the problem isn't that the products overseas, you know, aren't available in Australia. You know, by and large they are. It's just that this is an intractable problem. We don't actually have good drugs. No one has good drugs to treat worms in goats.
Thanks, Matt. Matt, and I think this question was dealt with when my internet dropped out. We spoke about quarantine drenches. I came halfway through the sentence. Is it okay to use drenches for quarantine purposes?
Yeah, Baron actually covered that one.
Great.
It's a very good idea to do that. And again, with the recommendation of your veterinarian.
Thanks, Matt. A bit of a question here on dose rates. Is it best to use what's written on the label or 150% of the recommended dose rate?
Now, just to clarify, the only person who can give off-label advice is the vet who looks at your goats. So I can give very general advice, but you really need to consult your vet. If you feel that your vet needs a little bit of motivation, then there are resources available from ParaBoss that go directly to vets. But we're not going to do anything that's unethical or illegal in giving information to people that recommends off-label use when it's only available in one bulletproof method.
Thanks, Matt. And we had a lot of questions covering off on that or written slightly differently. So I think the message is very clear there. You need to go to a vet to look at off-label dose rates and giving different drenches to goats. So
no shortcuts, I'm afraid.
Yeah, we've got a lot of...
Can I make a comment with off-label? And the thing is, you've got to understand that your vet cannot contravene if it has a do not use in food producing animals on the label, and all goats are deemed to be food producing animals, no matter whether they're a pygmy or a boar or a rangeland, or a fibre for cashmere or mohair, they are deemed to be food producing animals, unless they have a permit that has been issued by the APVMA. Your vet can make an application, and there are permits out there for goat herds where their vet has made an application to use a particular drench in a particular situation. It's not a blanket permit, it's only under particular situations.
Thanks, Baron. That was a good clarification there. And we don't want to gloss over that issue, but I do have a lot of other questions that have come through that are on a different tact, and we will go back. We've got a lot of questions about withholding periods coming up too. Will a pour-on be registered in Australia for goats? Do you know of any research coming along the tracks for that, guys?
The short answer is I don't think it will. We do a lot of research for various veterinary pharmaceutical companies, and there's no indication that a pour-on will be registered for goats. And look, to tell the truth, it wouldn't be a good idea because it probably wouldn't be absorbed as well as an oral or injectable product. And we've got a very good example from France where they've gone back and checked the efficacy of the pour-on aprinomectin compared to an oral equivalent, and it definitely does not work as well. And it just sort of emphasises the fact that there's no shortcuts with goats. We have to treat them with respect.
Thanks, Matt. There's another question that's come along on a similar tact, which was about a trial that's been finalised with cattle backliners for the treatment of worms in goats. But also in addition to that, a couple of questions have come through about cattle injectables being used in goats.
Baron?
They are not allowed unless you have permission in writing from your vet. And your vet, to enable that, to write down that position in writing, has to have the research and the information to back up that information and keep that for at least, some states vary, but it's at least a minimum of 2 years.
Yeah, and that may be information that simply isn't available to anyone at the moment. So please don't get angry at your vet for not being able to do it, because you might be trying to get information that just does not exist.
Unfortunately, because we all love our goats and they're very important, they're a big part of our life. In the whole scheme, agricultural scheme, goats are only a little minor part of that sector. And until companies see that the goat industry is a viable economic industry to do the research on the products, then it will take some time.
Next question, does Q-Drench kill worms and their eggs? And also, how long after drenching can I put my does onto a clean paddock? Should I leave them in a holding yard overnight?
Okay, well, look, I can talk about Q-Drench in sheep, and there's one component in Q-Drench, which is albendazole, and it does actually kill eggs. So we know that the whole class of chemicals that albendazole is a member of is ovicidal, which means it kills the worm eggs in the dung. The bit about when to shift goats, again, that's very individual farm, horses for courses type information. But in general, it takes about 2 to 3 days for goats to pass out their gastrointestinal tract contents from the abomasum, the forestomach, through to the rectum. Now, if they're on very fibrous diet, it might take a whole week. And so even after a fully effective drench, there may be worm eggs coming out up to a week later. So there's no magic number. It's somewhere between 3 and 7 days. But yes, you can get still eggs passing out up to that period.
Thanks, Matt. Is there a long-acting injection? Oh, sorry, Baron.
I was just going to say, be very, very careful with Q-Drench. Recently, there have been cases of people not reading the fine print on the container, as in not treating under a certain age and under a certain weight. There are, unfortunately, have been producers who have lost animals because of not reading the label properly.
Thanks, Baron. Is there a long-acting injectable drench suitable for goats? And this came from a miniature goat farmer.
Short answer is no, and the long answer is no.
Just on that, we've had another little bit of feedback about the LA, so that relates specifically to the Cydectin LA. Is that something that you can speak to your veterinarian about? Yeah, can you just expand your comments on that, Matt?
Yeah, it's probably one of the subjects that is least palatable to us as veterinarians, because there's a lot of risk involved in using long-acting treatments and not much reward. In fact, the times that I see people using long-acting injections, they have an unsustainable farm. They have a system that's set up to breed worms, and they're giving them back to their goats all the time. That's a non-viable farm. And so I'd much rather address the problems with the pasture management, with the animal management, with the diagnostics, than reach for the next most powerful long-acting treatment, which is simply a band-aid on an amputated limb. It's not going to work long-term.
Thank you, Matt. The next couple of questions are to do with milk withholding period. And first question, what drenches would you recommend for dairy goats, bearing in mind this milk withholding period, please?
All yours, Baron.
Unfortunately, the only one that is currently registered for that has a withholding period is febendazole, which is otherwise more commonly known as Panacur. It does actually work in, well, you have got Panacur for farmers. Independence Own is no longer available. WSD, febendazole, they all have milk collected from does within 24 hours following treatment, must not be used for human consumption or processing or fed to kids. So what a lot of producers tend to do is treat the goats when they are not lactating, so then you don't have the wastage. Some producers use that milk and turn it into soap. The issue is that sometimes potentially you have people who have a sensitivity to the drugs, so they can't use the soaps. You don't know who you are selling, potentially if you're selling soaps, whether the eventual consumer has a sensitivity to the chemical or not. Other things that which can be used off-label in dairy goats are your biowormer, your Barbavax, and your copper oxide wire particles. The big thing with dairy goats is don't rely on chemicals. Look at what you can do on your property to reduce the larval load in the paddocks, reduce the access to the worms themselves, and improve nutrition.
Thanks, Baron. And a follow-up question to that, is it possible to estimate the milk withholding period for drenches if they're being used off-label with a veterinarian?
Yeah, look, this is a very, very challenging issue for dairy goat producers, because let's face it, the veterinarians have very limited information to make that call. And I think because of their ethical and legal concerns, they'll always err on the side of caution, and that is to actually remove the goat from the milking herd when it's being treated, and use targeted selective treatment of those goats.
Thanks, Mad. It's not quite worms, but I have one last question that came in, and since we've got you two on, I'm going to ask it on behalf of the person online. Is there a registered pour-on drench/lice treatment for goats in Australia? So you've already dealt with the drench side of the question, so how about a pour-on for lice treatment in goats?
There used to be, is the short answer.
Yeah.
There used to be. There was a product called Clout S which contained deltamethrin, and it was registered for goats, no longer available simply because all the sheep lice became resistant to that product. And so the manufacturers took it off the market despite the fact that it was very useful for goats. So I'm afraid that's another one where we have a gap in the market. Again, to put it rather indelicately, again, it's an off-label use that you'll have to talk about with your vet.
Thanks, Matt. Moving on to worm control in kidding does, do you recommend deworming or treating at kidding time?
I actually recommend doing your fecal egg counts prior to then. I mean, it's recommended to vaccinate your goats if you do vaccinate them 4 to 6 weeks prior to kidding, so you boost her immune system and ensure that she produces the best possible colostrum for the kids born. Basically, a fortnight before you are going to do that vaccination, do fecal egg counts, so you know whether the does do have a worm burden. Yes, they do. When her immune system drops, the counts do increase in the month pre and post, but your selection of where the does are going to be kidding, where those kids are then going to be reared and then weaned, looking at what's happening in the paddock should have happened actually prior to getting them pregnant, that long ago in some areas, because in some areas it can take 6 to 9 months to reduce the larval load on the pastures with Barber's poleworm, depending on the ambient temperatures. You've got to basically look at your farm as a whole. But yes, fecal egg counts prior, and if they are at a level which will affect them, definitely treat. Get the advice from your private vet, but consider if you're only treating just before they are about to kid or once they've kidded, what have the worms been doing to the potential growth of those kids whilst they've been inside their mum? Have they grown to their full potential if she's also been feeding worms while she's trying to grow kids?
Thanks, Baron. Moving on now to your FOMACHA, which you were speaking about, Matt. We've just got a couple of clarifying questions. At what age can I start the kids on looking at FOMACHA checks and start a worming program with them?
Look, FOMACHA can be done at any time. Just bear in mind that kids don't usually start to pick up worms until they've been grazing for a while. It does take a couple of weeks before the worms actually mature and start to suck blood. So even when there's heavy Barber's pole worm infestation of a paddock, the FAMA chart probably won't give you much information for non-grazing animals, so the unweaned kids. So a couple of weeks after they're weaned and they've been on a grass diet is usually the ideal time.
I feel like Fiona may well have
Glitched.
She'll come back in a second. We've got a few more coming through with regards to where do we learn about FAMACHA is one of the other ones just on that topic. If we can answer that one, that would be great. Matt?
Yeah, okay. Well, look, the place that I'd go to first is Goat Vet Oz, and that's of course the wonderful Dr. Sandra Baxendall, who gives these courses, and she's an accredited trainer and has the actual cards. Berin, you probably have the.
I was going to say Dr. Sandra's the only one I know that is an accredited trainer.
Mm-hmm.
I actually did her training when she came down to Victoria quite a number of years ago, and did the
Mm-hmm.
training with quite a number of other producers. And the FAMACHA is a really easy thing to do. Bear in mind though, Barber's pole worm is one of the few worms that causes anemia. You can also get anemia due to one of the types of lice that can affect goats, which is a blood-sucking louse. And you can get lowering in the colour as well due to some other diseases, but it is a good starting point. You need to, with the FAMACHA, you need to look at the whole animal with your fecal egg counts, what the eyes are like, their body condition scores, whether they've got any fecal soiling, scouring, and you don't get scouring with Barber's pole worm, whether they've got the bottle jaw, which it can be due to Barber's pole worm, but it can also be due to liver fluke, where they've got nasal discharges, and what their coats are actually like as well. So it's not just we'll give them a drench. You've got to look at the fecal egg counts. You've got to look at the whole and the animal as a whole as to the way forward and how you decide to treat.
Yeah, so just to repeat that, Goat Vet Oz, so GOATVETOZ. I hope Dr. Sandra doesn't mind us passing on her details, but she's definitely doing courses, and they have. She's been running some just recently.
I'm sure she doesn't. Dr. Sandra's online communicating in the chat.
Oh, hi.
We should have got her online today instead, and she could have chatted to us directly. So we'll move on to the next question, and that is all about drench resistance. We had a lot of questions about drench resistance. One of them, I'm just starting to face drench resistance in my herd. They've been using Matrix and Genesis, and the vet has recommended Zolvix for the next drenching, but concerned about going there.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't comment on something that's outside of the doctor-patient or the doctor-client confidentiality. I'm sure you can back your vet's call, but an easy way to check is to do the worm egg count 2 weeks after treatment, see how well it went. That's probably the bottom line as far as resistance goes.
Matt, when we're looking at drenches or anthelmintics with multiple actives, when we're using multiple actives, does it accelerate the development of multiple resistance?
No, it actually slows it. And this has been shown with both real life trials and with models. And the fantastic work done at the University of New England shows that it actually slows the development of resistance.
Thanks, Matt. And the next question follows on from that. Do you recommend rotating or using drenches in combination? So your message there.
Yes, so as a general rule, and this is a rule that was formed in the sheep world, not in goats, we recommend combinations rather than rotation. With goats, it's a bit more complex because we're really trying to avoid drenches altogether and then only using drenches that work for a particular reason. And so I can't say that there's a general rule, but in sheep, it's definitely combination rather than rotation.
Thanks, Matt. And next question, how do I know what active I'm using?
It's written on the label. So all the drenches will have the active ingredient and the concentration written on the label.
Okay, moving on to our next topic, and I do have other questions coming through the chat that will filter back into these topics, so we will head back. But heading into drench alternatives and organic control, are Barbavax and biowormers suitable for milking and meat goats?
Dr. Barron, have you experienced with people using biowormer for their milkers?
I know Dr. Sandra supplies a lot of people who do use it. You can, I have been told that you can actually write to the company and they will tell you that it's, whether it's organic or not. So you've got a certificate for your organic company that you're actually registered for with your milk. I've not actually used it myself, either Barbavax or biowormer, because fortunately I've not had Barber's pole worm diagnosed on my own property. I know I did have friends locally who had a Barber's pole worm issue, and it's very, very difficult to get it under control if you're in a high rainfall, high stocking density type of area.
Thanks, Baron. Next question, staying with Barbavax for a moment. Should I worm egg count after Barbavax, and if so, how long afterwards?
Yeah, good point. Look, again, I'm talking about experience with sheep. The dose rate for Barbavax is a 1 ml injection given 3 times 3 weeks apart, and then you'll start to get some protection. Now, the protection period, again, we know from the research trials done in sheep is probably going to be about 6 weeks. And we don't get full protection from Barbavax. We get partial protection. It might reduce the worm egg counts by about 2/3. And so it's good to monitor from about 3 to 4 weeks after the last Barbavax injection, and then there may be a reason to give another subsequent injection to keep on reducing the output of eggs.
Thanks, Matt. We had David Smith on a Sheep Connect webinar a little while back, all about Barbavax, and that can
is
be
that still available, by the way?
Yeah. Yes, it is. It can be looked up on the Sheep Connect New South Wales website, and his recommendation is to worm egg count 1 week before giving your next Barbavax injection, so at about 5 weeks post-vaccination for sheep.
I've just been chatting with Dr. Sandra in the background, everybody, and she's agreed that we can promote her to a panelist so she can join in the discussion, which is a bit of a treat. So are you guys happy for me to do that now?
Yes,
fantastic.
Yeah.
Hi, Sandra.
While we're getting Sandra online, we've got another question. Could biowormer be used on susceptible goats to lower pasture contamination?
Yeah, that's effectively the primary role of biowormer.
Yeah, and I'd say that it is expensive, but that's the key time to use it. So the most susceptible goats are going to be your weaners and your goats just before and just after kidding. So if you can only afford to feed it for short periods, that's the time to feed it.
Thanks, Sandra, and welcome. Next question we have through is still on alternatives here. What about plants that are high in tannin content? Are there some trees for cooler climates that provide condensed tannins that are palatable for goats to eat?
Yeah, this is a subject that comes up every time we go to the veterinary parasitology conferences, and it's true that there are some plants that contain condensed tannins. Probably the best studied one is this Lespedeza cuneata, and they find that it does reduce the worm egg count of the goats, even though it doesn't actually kill the worms. It seems to affect the worms directly and reduce the egg output. And there's others like acacia trees. The only problem is they're not that palatable. They're not that great nutrition quality. And so there's a bit of a a swapping of benefit against cost there.
I've used chicory as a part of an integrated worm plan on a dairy goat farm, and they've had some good success with that.
Thank you, Matt and Sandra. Next question has come in from a smaller holding. How could I introduce rotational grazing, especially on a smaller block, even when I wish to use multiple species?
I can throw something in there. If you've only got a small block, maybe you've got someone who has a horse somewhere nearby that you could actually borrow and offer some free grazing for. That's used in some of my smallholders' worm plans.
Thank you, Sandra. Do our other panelists have anything to add?
I was going to say something along the same lines. I had a situation where I actually adjusted my goats for quite a number of months on another property to give my place a break, and then gave them a quarantine drench before they came back. There are ways that you can look at. If you've got other producers in your area, like swapping, like Sandra said, with the horses, if it doesn't bring any other diseases or weed seeds or anything like that onto your property, working in with neighbours and friends is a good way to reduce the load, as in swapping the species out. You can do it. You've just got to work out the best thing in your climate. Heat is the best thing for drying out worm larvae. Unfortunately, cold, wet weather doesn't kill them.
Thank you. That's excellent advice and thinking outside the box. How do I determine if a paddock is okay for goats after it's been grazed with cattle? Matt, I'm sure you will be all over that one.
Yeah, there is a method. It's called a pasture larval count, and it involves taking grass samples all the way down to the ground and submitting them to the laboratory where they're washed out and the number of larvae are counted. Now, of course, that's a very, very expensive way of doing it. And so instead, what a lot of people do is they'll actually sit down with a map of the farm and look at each paddock and work out what type of stock were in there before. So if only cattle were in there before, then we can say there's a chance that there might be one or two worms that could be transferred onto the goats, the brown stomach worm and maybe the stomach hair worm. But by and large, cattle will provide, clean pastures for the goats. If goats have been grazing there before, or sheep, then you have to work out how wormy were those animals when they were on the pasture, and then the amount of time and the amount of pasture cover there is to protect the worm larvae against being dried out. And you can have a traffic light system so that a recently grazed pasture is going to be a red light. One that's been spelled for a while during hot weather becomes an orange light. One that's been spelled for a long time, particularly over summer, will give you a green light.
Thanks, Matt. With the recent floods, questions come through on the back of that. How do worm eggs cope with floodwaters, and can they be carried onto clean paddocks?
Well, the answer is yes, and generally you will have increased pasture contamination after wet weather, simply because the worm eggs hatch, thanks to the moisture, and they'll survive better in cooler, wetter weather.
And one of the other issues with floodwater is that it brings on weed seeds. You don't previously have diseases that you may not have previously had as well in the silt from properties up the valley or in different areas. So flooding is not a nice situation to be in. You get foot problems, worm problems. Goats don't have much fat on them, so they're susceptible to chilling as well.
Thank you. And last of our pre-ordered questions from everybody is, why do goats get bottle jaw even after drenching them?
Yeah, the simple answer to that might be that either the drench didn't work or the bottle jaw is caused by something other than barber's pole worms. As Beren mentioned before, liver fluke will also cause bottle jaw. And there are some conditions where goats lose protein through their gut or from other situations that could also cause bottle jaw.
Thanks,
So
Matt.
Yoni's disease is one I'd think about too.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sandra. How
Fiona,
long
can I just say
yes.
one thing as well? The other thing is with the FOMACHA score, when you're doing that, if you drench it, realise it will take at least a month to improve in one score on your FOMACHA card. It takes a while for the body to reproduce red blood cells when you get rid of barber's poleworm. So you have to boost them with better nutrition and other potential medications so that they can cope until their body system produces enough red blood cells to replace the ones that have been taken by the worms.
Thanks, Beren. How long can homunculus survive in the host?
I can take that one. I've looked it up. It's various references say 70 to 90 days is the lifespan of an adult homunculus.
Thank you. Whatever happened to the research conducted at Condobolin in the early 70s by Peter Holst and Cameron Allen? If anyone's familiar with that research.
Might have to take that one on notice, unless you're familiar with it, Beren or Sandra.
Just looking up my...
Well, let Sandra have a little look up and we'll come back to that, Sandra, because we've got a lot of questions. Is there a drench that will kill barber's poleworm that is also suitable for milk-producing goats? No, is the quick answer to that one. Matt, could you we've had a question come through about the positioning of worms on pasture. Where are they located in the pasture? If you could just tell us whether they're on the top, on the bottom. Thanks.
Yeah, so the studies that have been done have shown that the majority of the worms, 90% of the worms, are concentrated in the bottom 5 centimetres of the pasture sward and the top 1 centimetre of the soil. So there's a bit of a reservoir of worm larvae in the soil, and they randomly climb up the stalks of the grass. Once you get above that bottom 5 centimetres, yes, you still get some worm larvae, but the concentration or the numbers decline fairly rapidly.
Thanks, Matt. And also clarify for that question, larvae are found on all types of pastures, not just weeds, which was another one of those. Another comment that came through. Can goats pick up worms from wild deer, please?
There are a couple of species that are common to wild deer and goats. The most obvious one is the stomach hairworm, Trichostrongylus axii, but there are others, and wild deer have actually been studied down in the Gippsland as a source of worms for domestic species of animals. So there's been some great research done down there by La Trobe University researchers.
Thank you. We will be going over time. We won't get locked out. So thank you everybody for staying with us. Feel free to stay online. What can be used to clean out pens and kill eggs in a more intensive system?
I can
I was going to
answer
say
that if someone-
time and sunlight.
Yeah, there was some very poor quality research which looked at high nitrogen fertilisers, sort of like a producer demonstration site research that showed high nitrogen fertilisers would kill some worm larvae, but nothing really suitable to recommend.
Yeah, nothing really practical. As Beren said, the good old UVs, the sunlight and heat are the best allies you have there.
Thank you. Are young animals less than 4 weeks of age at risk of worms? And we did deal with this one in that they haven't started grazing yet, but this person has potty goats that are grazing well at 3 weeks of age.
Wow.
So
They'll definitely
would we
pick up
say
worms.
They will pick up worms.
Mm.
Thank you. How long should we spell paddocks and how often should we move goats onto a new paddock?
Depends on the climate, rainfall. So Wormbox have an excellent page on that. So have a look.
And the type of worms that are on your property as well. There's a really, as Dr. Sandra said, there's a really good graph. You've got to work out the life cycle and each property is different.
Thank you. Is there any research into shrub-based pastures for goats to encourage browsing behaviour so that they avoid the larval pickup on pastures?
Is that question in regards to growing Tagasaski, salt bushes or Eremophilus?
Well, it doesn't say, it just says shrub-based pastures.
There's been plenty of studies in sheep on it, and I know goats love salt bush and the Eremophilus, and it's designed for them because the larvae don't go up into the bushes, so they're browsing.
Thank you. I'm going to read this question out because it's quite long and it's a bit of a scenario. Are there any issues with goats and worms in dry rangeland environments? In southwest Queensland, there's the perception that due to dry conditions and goats mostly grazing mulga that they won't get worms. Other than if you introduce new goats from a herd, you may have come from a wetter area. Large areas across southwest Queensland have received good rainfall with good grass and herbage mass growing amongst the mulga. My concern is that there may be a worm issue starting to arise despite the good rain and wetter condition. What would your thoughts be? Is this a possibility?
I can answer that one.
Thank you.
We've known from decades ago, they did surveys of feral goats at abattoirs and we found they had a worm burden. So, and significant worm burdens. So yes, and I'm getting reports of deaths from worms from southwest Queensland.
Thanks, Sandra. Meat residues, can we test this in live animals?
This is a bit of a vexed issue. There is a national body called the National Residue Survey that does tests of goat meats every year and publishes their results. If you want to do it privately, then I wouldn't even know where to start. You'd actually have to maybe contact that authority and ask them if you could, find a laboratory that's willing to do it. I'm not sure if you're aware of any residue testing, Beren or Sandra.
We used to, because I used to be the standards officer for Queensland, we used to have cattle properties in quarantine because of lead residues, and they used to have to get fat taken from around the base of the tail and sent off to laboratories to get them tested before they could sell stock. So it's theoretically possible, but it would be extremely expensive, time consuming, and would take several months. So not really practical.
Thank you. Another question about using cattle on pastures to reduce Barber's poleworm and other worms, which we have dealt with, but I'll just refer that person back to the ParaBoss website because there are good information there on grazing with other species to help lower worm burdens. What is the best treatment for anemia once there are large Barber's poleworm burdens?
I can take that one too, if you like. I use iron injections and vitamin B, multivitamin B injections. Goats, to make new red blood cells, they need energy, protein, iron, and vitamin B12 or cobalt, and time, as Beren said.
Thank you. How can we use a combination drench if there's only one registered drench?
Via your vet with a veterinary prescription.
Thanks, Sandra. What is Barbavax?
It's basically it's a secret process, but basically they get the Barber's poleworm, grind them up, sterilise them and inject them. Matt, you want to comment?
Yeah, I went to the Barbavax factory over in Albany, Western Australia, and saw the process. And it's exactly as you described, Sandra. It's a very sophisticated process to filter out the proteins that protect sheep and by extension goats against the Barber's poleworms. And then there's an adjuvant that they mix it with, which causes an immune response. So yeah, that's effectively what Barbavax is.
Is there any research the benefit of diatomaceous earth we've added to feed for worm reduction?
There is some research that says it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And DE cannot be used in goats because it is not a registered product. If you want to use DE in goats for either lice or for worming, you have to get a permit from AVPMA.
Thank you. If you do not drench and start biowormer and the goats stay where they are, how long before the worms will be gone?
That really depends on the worm burden, larval burden, and how many worms are in the paddock. As the biowormer is designed to kill the larvae that hatch out of the eggs in that particular fecal pellet. They don't spread around the paddock. They only treat the fecal pellets that are produced when the animal has consumed that product. So over time, the larval burden will get down. And as Dr. Sandra said, the adult worms inside the animal will eventually die. The big thing about it is trying to reduce the larval uptake so you don't get the new infections happening.
Thank you.
Is that how you see it, Dr. Sandra?
Yeah, it kills 86% of the larvae in the manure. So you've got to wait till the larvae on the pasture have died off before you see the results. But some smallholders have had some excellent results because basically they're feeding every day anyway. But it does take time to work. And in this weather, it's going to take several months before you break that cycle.
Thank you. Is Barbavax available in New Zealand and the United States?
That might be one for you, Fiona.
Barbavax is currently, to my knowledge, not available in New Zealand or the United States. My best advice would be to hop on the Barbavax website and email them directly to find out how you can get Barbavax in your area. It is currently distributed throughout Australia, mainly on the eastern seaboard, and through South Africa. Okay, my computer's jumping around here a little bit. Oh, what other feed additives apart from biowormer are available for control of worms? And is there any research around their efficacy?
None to my knowledge.
Yeah, in general, I think as Beren alluded to before, nutrition plays a big role in how well goats cope with a worm burden, and that's called resilience. Increasing protein levels and making sure they have adequate energy is probably the best feed additive.
Thank you, Matt. Okay. A few comments that bioworm is organic. It's on the label to clarify. So thank you for that. Does bioworm have the same effect as Drench?
No.
Totally different.
Totally different mode of action.
So Fiona, Pam's just got her hand raised. Pam, would you mind typing into the Q&A tab and we can attend to your question? Just wanted to mention that, if that's possible.
If you are moving out of sheep and going into goats, how long do you have to wait after sheep to be 100% sure that there is no worms on the pasture?
Yeah, I'm afraid it's not going to happen. Worms have been, at this game for thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, and they've adapted ways of getting onto pasture and staying there. So even though we can predict how they decline in numbers, there'll always be some larvae survive, whether it's in a fence line, in weeds, wet patches, creek beds, places around dams that remain damp. There's always a likelihood that there will be some worm larvae surviving.
Thank you. I've just realised that Sandra's answered some of these questions online, so I'm just trying not to double up on anything. Beren, you mentioned nasal discharge. If a goat has nasal discharge but not an elevated temperature, what may that indicate? That might be a bit too hard to answer, Emma, without additional information, but I will ask it because you've stayed online. Thank you.
It could be due to lungworms, the dustiness of the feed or what they're eating. It depends on the colour of the discharge, the type of discharge, and how the animal is breathing as to whether it's potentially a pneumonia problem, a lungworm problem, or other causes.
I've got to say, this has been both the longest and the most varied Q&A session I've ever been involved in. This is awesome. Thanks everyone for making it happen.
No worries. Well, just while you're up to varying things, while I'm filtering through, do drenches kill dung beetles?
Okay, so there are impacts on dung beetles, but in general, the drenches that we use in livestock don't have a big impact on the dung beetle populations, even though it's possible to kill the individual adult dung beetles. The juvenile dung beetles tend to eat the actual fibre in the dung, not the juice. Now, having said that, we do want to protect our dung beetle populations, and the external parasite treatments that we use on livestock are probably going to have a much bigger impact on the dung beetle populations than the drenches.
Thank you, Matt. I do have a comment which is slightly less filled. I'm going to pop it out there because I have heard this feedback from goat producers in panel meetings before about their concern for the industry regarding people getting their recommendations from Facebook. Would you like to comment on how that may affect the industry?
It could actually stop it. Basically, if you've got goats and you're registered with LPA to get NVDs, you can be randomly audited. You are required to record what you give your goats within 48 hours of doing it. If you use something off-label and do not have written permission from your private vet, you can get fined for doing it. The issues with using things without getting permission and the correct withholding periods means that potentially your milk product or your meat product may end up in the human food chain. And if it's detected, you might be the cause inadvertently or whether it's intentional or unintentional, the cause of product being exported to particular countries being stocked. Because there are hardly any, there used to be, but hardly any export slaughter intervals for goat meat products. Majority of our products are exported overseas. It means because there's no export slaughter intervals, means the product has to have zero, nothing in it. No chemicals at all when they go overseas. And Matt can give examples of the dairy industry where, Matt, did you want to mention the dairy industry?
Well, look, it's a big issue, particularly with antibiotics in the dairy industry. And if a farm actually has a milk pickup where antibiotic residues are detected, then the whole tanker and possibly even the whole silo of milk, and that will be rejected. And then there are costs of clean out of those silos. So it's something that the dairy industry, I think, have shown a lot of leadership and governance of in the past, and they're probably just paving the way for what's going to happen in the goat industry as well. The person who actually created the problem is the one who pays for it.
Thanks, Matt. Another question's come through on where to get the BarboVax vaccine from, and I'm happy to answer that. The BarboVax vaccine is available now throughout all Nutrien stores on the Eastern Seaboard. I do believe Elders are now stocking it as well, along with a smaller number of commercial resellers, private resellers, sorry, throughout, and you may be able to contact your vet to get help with that, but vets normally just contact the BarboVax line if you can't get it. Now, that has just dealt with Australia. Where you get it from overseas, you would have to contact BarboVax themselves. We're getting to the end of the question time. There are a few more questions in the Q&A. I'm going to apologise in advance if I've missed any in the chat. The chat has got awfully confusing with everybody typing comments in answering each other's questions. So if I haven't answered your question, the Q&A box is pretty much empty. If you pop it in there again, I will be able to see it very, very clearly. So just popping that out there. What time frame to rest paddocks before grazing a goat herd will enable the parasites to all hatch out and not reinfect the goat? Would 12 months rest or more be effective, or can I do it in less?
I'll tackle that one if you like. We know pretty well from trials that have been done that if you spell paddocks over summer when the temperatures are very high, then 90% of the worms will be gone after 1 month. If you spell paddocks over the winter when temperatures are fairly mild, then it might take 6 months to achieve that same 90% reduction. So then we've got two complicating factors. First, did you start off with 5,000 larvae per kilogram of dry matter of grass, which means after you've got a 90% reduction, you'll be left with 500 larvae? Or did you start off with 50,000, which is not uncommon on goat farms, and by the end of 6 months, spelling and 90% reduction, you'll be left with 5,000 larvae per kilogram of dry matter of herbage. Now, if you start off with a very high contamination rate, even spelling it for 6 months or 12 months may not completely eliminate all of the worm larvae. So we have to work within practical limits. We're trying to get from a high worm larvae to an acceptable worm larvae contamination level. And that will depend, as has been outlined previously, mostly on the temperature, also on the amount of UV light, and that will be complicated by the type of pasture as well, because chicory plants, for example, provide a lot more shade to those lower parts of the grass and the soil than upright plants like ryegrass.
Thanks, Matt. We just have a couple more questions left and I'm going to wrap it up. But one of the questions is regarding apple cider vinegar with garlic, and it's been asked by many people if it helps, and not only just with worms, but is it good and worth giving to goats for their gut health?
I'm laughing because decades ago I was the technical advisor for a goat group that wanted to look at using garlic as a worm treatment. And they were doing fecal egg counts, so they were doing it properly. And the worms just went straight up. Worm eggs just went straight up, even though they were being fed garlic. Now, it really makes me laugh that people feed apple cider vinegar, which makes the rumen more acid, but they'll also feed them bicarbonate of soda, which makes their rumen more alkaline. And I can't see any point at all in feeding apple cider vinegar. Possibly to male goats to try and make their urine a bit more acidic, but it's going to cause rumen problems. Erin, do you want to comment?
I would have said it along the same lines.
Mm.
And the thing is, with adding anything to water, you still have to provide water that doesn't have the flavouring in it, because if the animal starts to not like the flavour of water which you've added something to, then they'll start to dehydrate, which causes more issues.
Thank you. Another question regarding biowormer, please. How many weeks should we use it before and after kidding? Or is it something that you use year round?
I'll take that one. Most of my clients that use biowormer have only got a small number of goats that they feed every day, so they feed it all year round. If expense because of the number of goats is an issue, which would be if you've got a number of goats, then I recommend 2 weeks before kidding and 6 to 8 weeks after. So you're killing a lot of the larvae at the peak worm egg time.
Thank you. There's lots of questions about biowormer and Barbavax, and they have very good websites that I encourage everyone to go back to and look at for the industry recommendations on using both of those products. So we've answered, I think, most of the questions, and I do apologise in advance if we missed any of your questions. There were a lot of repetition in the questions, which was good because it means we addressed a lot of them in one answer. So I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to our wonderful panellists, to our presenter, Matt and Berin and Sandra for jumping on at the last minute. It was lovely to have you here, and we're very lucky to have such experts in the world of goats joining us here today. And I'd just like to say that we've had a lot of wonderful comments come through on the chat as well, thanking you all for participating today, and people have found the webinar to be very informative. So that's always good to get great feedback. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, you.
Fiona.
I'm glad that there are that many people that are interested in how to improve the welfare and the health of their goats, and for ParaBoss for putting this on.
Thanks, Berin. I'm just going to switch screens back over now, so I won't be a moment.
Had a lot of people stay on for the entire time. Like, it's been a really well attended.
Yeah, everyone deserves a good cup of coffee now, I think. Well done, everybody. So just a quick follow-up. We have a follow-up survey that will come out to you. The post will be in the chat box when it closes off today, and the link will also be emailed out to you. 5 really short questions, and we at ParaBoss thank you in advance for filling it out. We love your feedback. We take it very seriously, and I do spend a lot of time going through it to get your ideas on how we can improve and keep delivering to you. And save the date before I lose you all. Spotlight on small brown stomach worm on the 21st of June at 1 p.m. I think that will just be an hour webinar. It won't be a Q&A session that goes for nearly as long as the presentation. So thank you, everybody. That's all from us here today at ParaBoss. It's been wonderful to have you on board, and I look forward to seeing you all again next month. Bye for now.
Thank you.